Hello, this is Dan Ferrisi, Group Editor, Commercial and Security with Commercial Integrator here at the HDBaseT Alliance booth at InfoComm 2025. We're going to be talking a bit about tariffs, and we brought a great person who knows a whole lot about the economic landscape, particularly as it relates to our industry, Sean Wargo from AVIXA. Thank you so much, Sean, for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here, Dan, always to talk to you. Happy to shoot the breeze about tariffs and all the other regulatory factors, yeah.
Sounds good, yeah. So why don't we talk a little bit about how tariffs, we're hearing about it in the news all the time, so we know about the topic writ large, but how is it circulating down to our industry in concrete ways? I'm sure there are many different things you could point to, but concretize it a little bit, make it less theoretical.
Yeah, I think that, from the top, right, the biggest challenge for us is the sort of fog of uncertainty. It's as business leaders trying to learn how to adapt what is a changing landscape. The fortunate thing for us is we just came through a really rough period, you might have remembered, called COVID-19 pandemic, in which supply chains were severely disrupted.
Yeah.
And so therefore required a lot of flexibility, agility to kind of responding to that situation. So you could consider a tariff another supply chain factor. It's another disruption that you have to consider in your supply chain management. Where am I going to source? Who's my partner? How do I go about that? Both short and long term. Tariffs, because we've seen this kind of flexible, ever-shifting environment to it, you kind of think a bit more creatively about how do I stay agile in my pricing to my customer, so put things into contracts that allow me to essentially account for and accommodate of rising costs to the product itself. Work with my distributor to ensure that I have a plethora of options that might help me outmaneuver the tariff by sourcing from a slightly different supplier or brands that's got an advantage in the supply chain toward less tariff advised countries, suppliers. And then, of course, it's just straight up pass-through of cost in some cases. Been seeing a lot of that yet. I think because there was, of course, this surge in percent tariff that got back down right at the new date of July 9th, I believe it is, to which that expires. But that kind of pushed forward. Use this negotiating tactic, kind of push it forward. So we haven't had to see a lot of actual cost price increases as of yet, but that's certainly a part of the response too. So agility, that's the key, is how does our market adapt and account for what is essentially in the supply chain, an increase in cost to the products, yeah.
And as you say, we may not have borne the full brunt of that yet because we're coming up upon that July date when the 90-day kind of pause or the 90-day abeyance patches up. So we'll see what happens at that point. I appreciate your idea, though, about integrators maybe trying to be a little bit more protective of themselves. We just recently did a webinar about optimizing your T&Cs to make sure your contracts are working for you, not against you. Because if you send out a proposal, what the reality 60 days later or 30 days later could be very different from the time you drafted the proposal. It sounds like that's something integrators really need to be on top of, optimizing those T&Cs and making sure they don't get over their skis and end up with an unprofitable project.
Oh, 100%. I think if you hadn't learned that during the pandemic, you're certainly learning it again now. So during the pandemic, when we had the supply chain disruption, they flat out could not get product and ended up being higher cost because of just straight demand factors. The other manufacturers who actually had product available, their prices ticked up because, of course, the demand on their supply was being strained. So you had at that time an integrator who needed to actually change the T&C. Maybe it's a surcharge, maybe it's a flexible pricing term, whatever it might be. Absolutely. In this environment, with knowing that there could be continued shocks, continued issues, maybe we have, I don't know if I put a name to it, but just let's say other black swan events that may be the disruption. I think it just makes sense to be flexible, and that means contractually flexible to be able to account for what could be a rising cost. And to be even more, say, benign, a need to shift the specification. So the project was scoped in the following way and had the following requirements and technical specs. However, as that conversation evolves, as the landscape evolves, since we know these projects are often long in the planning, be able to shift to a different technology that they have evolved. And so you want to have that flexibility as well. So I think they get that sort of stuff, but it's always a good reminder to pay attention to your T's and C's, your basic discipline around how you run the business.
So obviously we are a world unto ourselves in AV, but we are an island within a broader, macroeconomic ocean, and we're affected by the trends and the tides in that ocean. Right after the reciprocal tariffs were initially announced, you go to a place like Polymarket, recession odds rose to like 70%. Now I think they're down to like 28, 29%. How concerned do you think our industry should be about macroeconomic anchors holding down our potential to grow?
I would certainly point to it as a limiting factor. So the other impact of a tariff is the hedge effect that might create on demand. So the end user buyer is saying, I'm going to wait a little bit. I don't want to pay an increased cost. I'll maybe push my timeline, rescope, delay, whatever it might be. So certainly an incoming demand's impact, shaving off a few points. If you look at outlooks, though, absolutely in the United States, the GDP outlook has been revised down a couple 0.2, 0.3 off the top line. So we expect slower economic growth. The thing we're seeing in our surveys, though, among end user buyers, is they're actually telling us for Q3, you know what? I understand the tariff landscape. I've got mission critical projects that I have to go through forward with for collaboration, for engagement of customer, broadcast TV, all the things. So they're saying we're prepared to pay a little bit more if we need to keep those projects going. They may delay, they may rescope a little bit. That's another response. But I think for now, we're seeing that for our industry, which has tended to buck the trend of GDP anyway since the pandemic, that we will do okay. We're going to be okay. AVIXA is expecting lower growth rate this year than we've seen in past, but certainly still growth, still better than GDP growth as we look forward. So I'm optimistic about it, even as I recognize the very real, let's call it threat or challenge to the demand side of the story.
I'm glad to hear you're still forecasting growth. I think it was in January or thereabouts we had spoken. I think at the time you were expecting a CAGR of about 5.35%. I guess you probably revised down from there, but still above GDP.
Yes, our new forecast to be released here to InfoComm is 3.9.
Okay.
So as we've talked a lot about this in the past. Our traditional, more historical, has been in the 5 to 6 range as we look forward. We think because of the sort of headwinds that we're facing, geopolitics, tariffs, inflation, high interest rates, those sorts of things, they remain a bit of a dampener. At the same time, though, underneath the hood, some of it is supply ramped up. So over the pandemic period, to respond to rapidly increasing demand, some categories of technology started shipping at a very fast rate. Displays come to mind. And so there you're seeing price decline. So some of our story actually in industry has been, it may look like less revenue growth, but the volume has increased dramatically.
Right.
So a lot more scale and deployment of collaboration systems, certainly even broadcast AV, command control, all those areas. You may see a little lower price point on the average project, but because there's so many more out there to go after. So it's kind of a mixed story, a little bit of a price point deflation story, but certainly demand there underneath.
Are there key indicators you have your eye on over the next 6 months, over the next 12 months, to give us a sense, if we continue to have these tariff gyrations, how bad it could be or how good potentially the market could be? What are you keeping an eye on? What are you watching?
I would say I still watch inflation. You can't not look at it because several things. One is, of course, our Fed and the U.S. is watching it to peg whether or not to do interest rate drops. Interest rate drops would certainly be a fuel to the fire. So at that point, capital costs go down. Companies are a little more willing to invest in big CapEx projects, even as they've shifted some to more operationals. So you watch inflation to see, are we still trending okay? Or are we getting top line impacts to cost to consumer, which then really create a headwind? And I think that's where the Fed's perspective is too, as much as you will glean from it, is we need to make sure that we're not stagflating. It's the word often used. Right. Price points kind of keep going up. That represses demand. That sort of spirals you a bit. Because typically what happens is unemployment then becomes more at risk. You see more layoffs. So your unemployment rates go up. All those things matter in the end to us as an industry because it kind of indicates, do our customers, and they have a revenue generated from their customer, the consumer, that then fuels investment in us as an industry. So watching that right now, as you mentioned, the outlook for recession continues to improve. I've heard from the financial firms, similar to you, 30 to 35% likelihood. We were, throughout the 3 years in the pandemic recovery, we maintained at 40 to 50% likelihood of a recession. During that whole time, it became honestly a running joke. Yeah, between me and my staff was like, yep, guess what? There's still a recession coming. I don't know where it is. You just come. So I'm not trying to belittle it.
I know what you mean, though.
It's probabilities matter only so much, because 30%, 1 in 3, still real.
Yeah.
But less likely than likely.
Right.
And that's the key point. So I think we remain fairly optimistic, even as we kind of see a headwind in front of us.
So obviously we're speaking at the HDBaseT booth. I'm wondering if you can speak how standards like HDBaseT might be able to maybe insulate our industry from supply chain disruptions. Are standards part of the solution?
Yeah, it's been a constant conversation this show, because as we look at areas like broadcast AV as a solution, some of the challenges there are standards-based. We need reliability, we need compatibility, we need usability, we need agility in our solution scoping. And so where a standard kind of comes into play is a plug for more open in this case is it gives you more options. So if I'm shopping the market as a solution provider, trying to recommend to my customer what to use, if I can be agile in who I source from because they have supply chain advantage, aka tariff advantage, then that I can swap out, right? I can help the customer stay at a price point conducive to their investment, their use case, and remain agile for that. So I think that's where it comes into play. The more that there are these kind of options on the table, I think that's the flexibility that our industry continues to need to be able to respond to a wide variety of use cases in a chaotic kind of macro environments that makes that kind of challenge.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. If there are these country by country, supply chain by supply chain challenges, a walled garden can potentially be very dangerous, because if you are locked into one supplier, for example, and one supply chain, that's putting a lot at risk.
Absolutely. We saw that during the pandemic. There were certain manufacturers that had more or less challenge with their supply chain disruptions. And so it did create vulnerability, risk in the market, and some, therefore, fluidity, movement around from manufacturer to manufacturer. So absolutely a key point. That's the key at the end. Yeah, be agile.
Any closing thoughts as, again, we continue to watch what's going to happen in July, what's going to happen in August? Any closing thoughts you would share for those who are maybe anxious about tariff-related concerns? I mean, for good reason, or any positive spin you might put on what the overall trajectory for the industry is?
Yeah, it's one of those times where you don't want to belittle anxiety, right?
Yeah.
There's some very understandable concern and trepidation about the landscape. I think the best advice most therapists are going to be these days is to put down the phone, stop reading the headlines, disconnect for a little bit, look at your business. So I think in the end, it comes down to pipelines. It's, as you're looking at your portfolio customers, how diversified are you? What are you only, say, serving corporate, only serving learning, education, or are you starting to look at maybe hospitality? Maybe there's a retail angle. Maybe there's a venue angle in your market that you haven't explored. So continue to look at your customer base. Continue to look at your supplier vendor base, making a trade show, obviously. So I'm plugging, of course, at InfoComm a little bit, but these environments give you the chance to kind of start new conversations, look at things maybe in ways you haven't before. So keeping that agile, kind of flexible mindset allows you and supports this notion of a bit more optimistic. You're sort of seeing the world as your oyster, seeing lots of opportunities, seeing lots of option available to you. That's how you kind of combat the news cycle, the doom spiral.
Yeah.
Kind of, oh God, we've got another tariff that might impact my ability. I admit I'm concerned about things like aluminum and steel tariffs. Those are fundamentals that make it challenging for manufacturers, because raw material stuff is a little harder. And again, there's scarcity there that's a little harder to shift around from a perspective, a global perspective. But I remain optimistic that there is plenty of globalization still there. Is there still a very much a global market?
Yeah.
And so that means there's a lot of option to be flexible. But I'm going to keep hitting that word. Agility and flexibility is definitely the key.
I think you're absolutely right. And you're correct. There is a lot of opportunity out there, but I do think you need to be agile and flexible in evaluating what opportunities are most available to you and how you can pivot your organization potentially to leverage those. I always leave smarter when I talk to you, Sean. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Danny.
My name is Dan Ferrisi, Group Editor, Commercial and Security with Commercial Integrator, here at the HDBaseT Alliance booth at InfoComm 2025, doing thought leader interviews with some of the brightest minds in the industry, talking about the topics of the day.